Welcome to the final event in our Summer Writers Institute Public Program Series. I'm Pat Matthews. The Summer Writers Institute is offered through University College, the Continuing Studies School of Washington University. We're very pleased to have Deborah Taffa with us for her talk entitled A Tribute to Sensory Details and Self-Care. A few logistics before we begin. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to submit questions for Deborah. Questions can be submitted at any time, and we will take them at the end of her talk. Use the chat button if you have other questions or concerns. This evening's speaker, Deborah Taffa, is the director of the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. She earned her MFA at the Iowa Writers Workshop. She's been a fellow with Public Space, MacDowell, Hedgebrook, Tin House, and Kranzberg, and is from the Quechan Nation and Laguna, Pueblo. Deborah is the winner of the PEN Jean Stein Grant for her recent memoir, Whiskey Tender, forthcoming from HARPERCOLLINS in 2023. The judges for that award noted, Whiskey Tender, an original work told through a strong voice full of clarity and pain as well as humor, expresses the vast scale of violence that Native peoples, particularly women, navigate on a daily basis, ranging from the body to community, land, environment, and nation. More than ever, Whiskey Tender is an urgently necessary work that reveals Taffa's considerable skill as a gifted writer, story gatherer, and storyteller, and where, as Taffa shares, remembrance is political. Please welcome Deborah Taffa.
Thank you, Pat. I don't know that I had heard that before. I guess I read it and it went over my head from PEN America. Such kind words. Thank you for inviting me. And I want to thank my writing students from the week 2 for engaging with me so rigorously in the past couple of weeks. They're an amazing cohort, and we've had some really intense conversations. I hope the same is happening in the rest of your classes for those of you who are at the Summer Writers Institute. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about the trepidations and challenges that a memoirist faces when they first start putting their pen to the page, like in the very beginning especially. And I also want to offer you some strategies to get you through your first book or through your first published personal essay. So 10 years ago in the spring, I graduated with a BFA in literature from Webster University in Webster Groves, Missouri. I was what people call a non-traditional student. I didn't get my degree until I was 38 years old. And that July, only 2 months after I finished at Webster, my husband and I loaded our kids, our family dog, and our furniture into a moving van because I had accepted an offer to go into the program, the MFA in creative writing program up in Iowa City, Iowa. I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, as they say, sure that my time pursuing my advanced degree was going to propel me quickly and easily toward a wonderful writing future. We hopped on the Avenue of Saints and drove north to Iowa City, where I prepared to study with the masters. So classes started, and my teachers said things like, write close to the bone, dig deeper. They said the difference between journalism and literature is the extent to which the author allows himself to be wounded by the facts. They said it's only by feeling your story deeply that your reader will also experience emotions. There was only one teacher who said anything different, and that was Ethan Kanan, the author of The Palace Thief, which some of you might know. It was made into a movie with Kevin Kline. And Ethan told my class that he arrived in Iowa City as a student, as a fiction writer, to earn his MFA, and that he promptly stopped writing. Whereas before he had arrived in Iowa City, he loved scribbling stories. Once he got there, he was frightened by the way the program was so competitive. And all the craft talks, like the way that people talked about how to build a story, made him self-conscious when before he had been writing intuitively. And he just simply froze up. And he told us that he didn't write a single word his entire time that he was in Iowa City in the program. and that he left and thought, I'm a failure as a writer. And he went to medical school. And it wasn't until years later that he started taking story notes on his prescription pads. So in one hand, I was hearing, you must bleed on the page. And on the other hand, I had this anomaly, this teacher who said, for some of us, the art of writing feels like a psychological burden, even after your talent has been noticed. It's arguable that by the time you get into an MFA program, people are telling you you're doing something right. And yet it's easy to freeze up. And I've thought a lot about that. I want to share on some of that tonight and give you some strategies, as I said. Let's see, let's go to the second slide. For the most part, I do believe that my creative writing teachers were right. Readers of memoir want emotion and feeling. They want to hear about your life's drama. That's why they pick up your book. They want to be let in on your secrets. They want to witness your struggle, identify with your humanity, and understand your moral education. How have you come to find grace and bear living in this world? Memoirs are always, always about struggle. In fact, that's the difference between an autobiography and a memoir. It's failure. An autobiography, it tracks a person's successes. Jimmy Carter began as the humble son of a peanut farmer and rose to become the president of the United States. It captures, an autobiography captures the entire life rather than the sliver of a life, a sliver, and it tells the reader how this already famous person, in most cases, rose to his or her success. A memoir is just the opposite. It examines a small section of life, a season of grief, for example, in Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking, the struggle with a mental health issue in Therese Muller's Heartberries, or the rape of a child in the most famous memoir, right? I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Here, let me emphasize that it's not necessary to write about your most dramatic and traumatic memories when you write personal essays or memoir. But if you do, and you do it well, your readers will love you for it because it makes them feel less alone in their own foibles. Memoirs give us the sense that we're all in this together. Memoir allows us to see the world through another person's eyes. And in this way, it develops our empathy for each other. Here, it's important to note that sharing your story without shaping or culling or arranging your stories artfully is not enough. The reader wants to see you, an individual, an intelligent consciousness performing on the page. The successful memoir is no different than the novel or poetry in the art that it demands. To make your words live on the page, you must focus on giving your reader a visceral experience of your world. And this means that you must trust them enough to let them get up close and personal with you. You must craft scenes that make an emotional impact, and you do that with sensory details. A whiff of fresh bread, the feeling of a shoe stuck in gum, the sound of skiers carving snow. If you can access memories and feelings via the five senses, I'm going to care about your world and come along for the ride. Sensory details, writing close to the bone, offering your life up like you're wearing one of those GoPros on your head to record everything for your reader. You might sometimes be in the frame of a memoir, but most of the time you are the lens showing people what life looks like through your eyes. So I often say that writers are inspired and wake up in the morning because they want to make a point about the world. They want to flex their wisdom and let you know what they have learned. But it's never enough simply to tell people what we've learned. We have to show them how we came to that realization and let them have the realization for themselves. And we do this by writing close to the body with sensory details. And doing this as a memoirist I think it's uniquely challenging of all the genres. The poet can hide behind the voice of the speaker, and the fiction writer distances himself from his characters. The creative nonfiction writer or the memoirist is tasked with portraying real people and real memories. And here's the gist, including him or herself, which is incredibly challenging. The creative nonfiction writer is so close to her stories, it's hard for her to keep everything straight. Think about it. When you write creative nonfiction, you are juggling 3 roles at one time, because you are the narrator, the protagonist in the story, and the writer at the desk reflecting on your past. And I'm going to use an example from the world of film to explain what I mean by this. So I tried to pick a very popular movie that has an over voice, Stand By Me. It has Richard Dreyfuss as an adult, and the boys are the main thing is the kids, right? And the main bulk of the movie. But for the sake of illustration, let's say that Richard Dreyfuss is the one who wrote it rather than Stephen King, right? So the movie begins with Richard Dreyfuss on screen at 40 years old, let's say, sitting in his Jeep reading a newspaper article about his childhood friend, who he has discovered via the newspaper article. His friend has died of this violent death. And he's not speaking, he's just staring off into space, but the over voice that belongs to him starts to speak, and that's the narrator voice. And the narrator voice says, I was 12 going on 13 the first time I saw a dead human being. It happened in the summer of 1959, a long time ago, but only if you measure it in terms of years. Then Richard Dreyfuss flashes back to his childhood and the movie begins. And in his role as the protagonist, he's a 12-year-old looking for a dead body. The adult voice is still narrating while the child is the protagonist in the story. Now let's assume that Richard Dreyfuss was also the writer of the book that was made into this film. And he penned his memories the summer he turned 60. So he's sitting around and he remembers when he was 40 and his childhood friend died. And he found out via the newspaper, and he was dwelling on the impact of that death in his life. And he makes himself 40 in the narrative. So we have the retrospective writer at 60, the narrator who creates the frame for the story at 40, and the little kid as a protagonist running around in the summer of 1959. Even in the shortest essays, we're often positioning ourselves with flashbacks and portraying ourselves at different ages. And all of those ages represent a different capacity for realization. It's like a Russian nesting doll when you get into the time that you're building in a longer work, especially. So it's complicated. Craft-wise, it's complicated, but then the stress starts to amplify as the specific memories start to flood onto the page, right? The I word, the I in memoir or personal essay is very difficult to get right because in our minds, and here I'll rely on Philip Lopate, he says, the I is swarming with background and a lush, sticky past when we're using it for ourselves. Our brains are packed with everything that has happened with us, and even trying to decide what to cut and what to keep to illustrate a point is complicated. But The I is also fatally specific sometimes for the writer, because they don't realize that for the reader, it's vague. They don't realize that we have to create a persona on the page for ourselves. The writers, early writers, don't always realize that. We're trying to create a clear picture of who this I is, because otherwise people simply will not know what we have in our head, or even worse, they'll make assumptions. And for this reason, when you're writing creative nonfiction, you must actively build yourself into a character. And that can feel very uncomfortable, because when you look at it, it's always kind of, it's not completely you on the page. You have to leave things out because we're such contradictory in nature as human beings. It's very difficult to handle. So how do you turn yourself into a character? First, you need to acquire, any way that you can, some distance from yourself. And that word distance is important. And I'm going to try to break it down and illustrate ways that I think you can find some distance from yourself. And it's important also because psychologically it's necessary. So again, to quote Philip Lopate, he says, if you are so panicked by any examination of your flaws that all you can do is sputter defensively when you feel yourself attacked, you're not going to get very far in the writing of personal essays. You need to be able to see yourself from the ceiling, to know, for instance, how you were coming across in social situations, and to assess accurately when you are charming and when you seem pushy, mousy, or ridiculous. We dramatize ourselves. We perform who we are, even as the person we once were on the page may not be likable to us anymore, because we've grown up and changed. And here we start to kind of build and understand why creative nonfiction is a challenge. At turns, we must be self-deprecative, make light of ourselves, but we're also tackling conflict that we live through on the page. And we try to select topics that reveal what conflicted and hurt people we are, confused and trying to sort things out. And this is how we must tackle our own psychology, tackling how we can frame our past problem in a way that honors those problems without being overly dramatic on one hand, or on the other, too light or flippant. So, to kind of recap, if you want your story to pop into your reader's head a week after they have finished it, you must make your writing feel like it's something that they experienced. You must render yourself as a persona on the page and tell your readers secrets. You have to give them gossip and let them feel involved in your puzzling predicaments. You are not required to write about your most dramatic and traumatic memories, but if you want to write about them, people will enjoy it. And if I'm reading your work, I won't complain myself. So writing close to the bone in a way that moves your reader is hard when your family, your loved ones, your self-respect, and your ego are on the line. And as you have probably guessed, I realized that it was hard once I settled in Iowa City and started to write the memoir I had pictured for so long in my mind. Here I was, wishing I could be brave enough to portray a poor family on a Native American reservation with a father who was a jailbird before he became a welder. And the town I grew up in the Southwest was known as the Selma, Alabama of the Southwest. And the Civil Rights Watch had to come in to try to keep the peace because there was so much social strife. And then the most embarrassing and difficult thing for me to grapple with was the way that my family had been, we could say, brainwashed and assimilated by the US government via Indian boarding schools and assimilation policies, to feel that I didn't know my own history and my own culture, and to have to portray that in myself as a child on the page. was a very difficult thing to see. So when we write memoir, we confront ourselves. And there I was at 7 years old, thinking I could grow up and escape the hardships and the alcohol and the racism that I saw all around. And it seemed very heavy, and it felt very burdensome. And I didn't know how to strike a balance between what I felt was like this very deep emotion and sadness about my childhood, and some sort of levity. How would I ever write a story that anyone wanted to read? This is what I kept thinking. So before going into a few simple strategies about how to gain distance on yourself, so you can tell your stories that have both like a deep point of view and lots of sensory details, but enough sort of objectivity to shape it into a story that has a point and feels manageable and, you know, kind of has that authorial hand, that Whitman-esque take that lets people know why you're telling it. I want to give you a list of the strategies that help me. And then what we're going to do is, I'm not going to go into them deeply here, but we will look at some quotes. We'll examine some quotes from some famous writers who I feel like have employed these strategies as well, and from whom I learned. So the first bullet point shows the idea of using the second person address. So you're writing with the you. And when you write with the you almost always employ present tense. And those can be used jointly, or those can be used separately to spit out your first draft. Even if it doesn't stay in that tense or in that point of view, I argue that it's sometimes easier to gain distance on yourself and write in one or the other or both of them combined. And I've coupled this bullet point with the oft-forgotten power of humor. And in my book, I think of it as like a dark humor, gallows humor, because I think a lot of times it creates levity and gives your reader space to breathe. It allows them to enjoy the story rather than feel complicit in your wounding. And that's very important. The second is the concept of supposition in creative nonfiction. And I see students, especially students who are just starting out, confused by this a lot of times. Yes, we're dealing with facts, but there's a field beyond those facts that can bring you relief when you're writing your book. And I'll talk more about that and the cautionary tale when we get to the author's quote that I'm using as an example. And then finally, we have the idea of buried history or context. And this involves research. And even as the idea of literary community as relief is something that I'll talk about. So Mary Karr is the queen of the offbeat. I'm sure a lot of you know her work. She propelled to fame with the Liars Club. She uses lush language. She's a poet. That's what she studied before she wrote her memoirs. And she always makes her reader kind of really feel and experience what it's like to grow up in this little East Texas oil town. And despite the fact that her childhood is like very impoverished and kind of depressing and violent, you laugh the entire time. And this is an excerpt from her second book, Cherry. And to set the scene for it, I'll just tell you that she's walking to her friend's house while wearing a floor-length robe of black cotton cloth. Thus, monastically clad and unshod, you walk the tar-sticky roads holding your mother's orange and black yoga book. About halfway there, a roaring truck draws up on the rough shoulder, holding a whole crowd of bikini-clad girls and boys in cutoffs and back. Some girl asks real loud, "Where's the Halloween party?" while everybody else breaks in half laughing. The truck roars off, leaving a wake of twitters. And so whenever I do a close read of writing that is very close to the body, and I would say that this is all descriptive, and we'll talk about what that means on the next slide, but it's very descriptive, it's sensory, it's written, you're in the scene. I will ask students, what emotions would you ascribe to Mary in this scene? And if you have any words that you think, please type these emotion words that you're thinking into the chat. A lot of times as writers, when we write a passage that is strictly craft or description, we ask ourselves, what emotion do I want what my reader to land on? What emotion am I going for? Somebody says shame. Okay, that's good. I was going to say embarrassment. Yeah, Jan says embarrassment. Anyone else? Something slightly different? Sweaty, overheated. Okay, that's good too, because it's in the body. I would also say maybe defiance or a feeling of spunk, like she's an oddball and she doesn't care. We don't really get like how she feels about this, except by the tone. She doesn't tell us how she feels, but we don't really feel pity as we read this. And you haven't seen the whole page, but she kind of gives us permission to laugh a lot of times. So she writes in a way that is self-deprecating. She's a confused teenager, far from popular. People are making fun of her. She's dressed in this getup, and yet she's giving you a little fun with it too. Again, humor, people. It's never used enough by students in my class. And you want to cue your readers into this idea that it's okay. Here's another quote by Mary about this book that she wrote on why she used the second person address. She said, I needed to create a sense of detachment. At the time, I didn't have a self to be inside. She was so lost. She felt like she didn't have a self, and she needed that detachment that I talked about, objectivity, distance from the self. So look again at her walking down the road as a teenager. We can see and feel the way she's distancing herself. She says it's because she wants the tone and form of this book to be mimetic, essentially. In other words, she felt distance from everyone and everything as a teenager. But I know something else about Mary Karr, and that is that she says that she gets exhausted when she writes, that she doesn't know why. She can sit at her desk and write all kinds of other things, and she doesn't get tired. But when she's writing memoir and she's dwelling on the past, she can write for like 2 hours and she has to go down, lay down and rest. And it's because it's hard to take painful memories and spin them into gold. Once you have done it, you spend days and days working on passages. You have spent more time writing the passage than you did living that moment. And the memory kind of washes away, and the book or the essay kind of takes the place of the memory, which is very weird. 50% of Cherry is written in the second person address. And I discovered something when I read it, I started trying it. I thought, okay, it made me see myself as an outsider. And the present tense made me remember more details when I wrote. So if I was trying to write about my childhood living room and what happened after I got home from the Girl Scouts meeting or something, and I couldn't access memories, if I switched it to present tense, everything felt more imminent. It was like I was in the room. And you can't always keep things in, it's not practical to think, I'm going to keep everything in the present tense forever, because what do you lose when you write in the present tense? You're disallowing yourself to engage in any reflection. And to be clear, it's the reflective voice, it's the voice that looks back, that supplies a lot of times the meaning to a piece. It's the authorial a hand that tells people why there's meaning. It's the connective tissue between scenes. But writing in the first, in the you, the second person, or writing in the present tense, a lot of times will engage you in the world because you feel like you're actively moving through it, and you will see many more details emerge from what you're doing. And then later you can translate it into the past tense and decide how you're working with it and add in reflection. But in the beginning, especially, you don't want to worry too much about how you're connecting the scenes that you build. Just build a lot of different scenes and keep going. And the connective tissue can come later. Give yourself permission to be messy and immersive in what you're creating. And so that's my assignment for you, right? Eventually, when you leave tonight or tomorrow, get out your pen and paper and blast, unstructured, imminent, first person. You're in the space. There's no need to look back and reflect or to make sense of it. Put that copy away of that particular scene, and the next day, do it again without looking at that first copy. Another go at it, this event that you're writing, this big thing that happened to you. Present tense, drive through it. Do it 2 or 3 times and then compare the 3 pieces that you wrote. And those details that emerge and reemerge, they're real. They're the things that you can grab onto. There's something to them. They're at the center of the sensory experience that you have when you close your eyes and you try to remember that day. Let's see. Okay. The next one in this passage, we have Tobias Wolff as a teenager, wishing he could escape his violent stepfather and home. And it's from one of those books that started the memoir craze, right? It's called This Boy's Life. Some of you might have seen it. It was made into a movie with Ellen Barkin and Leonardo DiCaprio. And I think Robert De Niro was in it. While Skipper talked, I circled the car, toting up the damage. I opened the driver's door and poked my head inside. The floor had been carpeted in white. White leather covered the seats, side panels, roof, and dashboard. The light inside was rich and creamy. I got in behind the wheel and closed the door. I breathed in the smell of the leather. I ran my fingers over the seats, then leaned back with one hand on the wheel and the other on the gear shift. Softly, so no one would hear me, I made engine noises and worked the gears, looking through the pitted windshield at the blurry outline of trees along the road. If I didn't look too hard, I could almost believe I was moving. He's smelling it, he's seeing it, he's sitting there. What emotion, again, let's say, what emotion does Tobias land on in this passage? And again, you can write your words in the chat. It's a little more difficult, this one maybe. Somebody, those, okay, confidence, superior, adventure, yearning. Oh, that one's good, Abby. Superiority, I like that one. Curious, maybe awe, olfactory. Okay, very good. Yeah, yeah, that yearning. What is that about? We can pick up that it's I mean, that's very perceptive, I think, or wishful thinking. Feeling trapped is the shadow of that because he's in a car. And since he's pretending to drive it, you know, this guy wants to escape, you know, he's trying to get out. You know, I think this, he's writing about himself. So he remembers exactly what he was feeling. We look at him and we suppose that we know the emotion because it's being portrayed in such sensory detail to us that it feels like it's happening to us. We know. There's more than just memory at our disposal when we write, right? Let's start with that thought. We have photographs that we can pull out. We can interview people in our family that we know. We're often delving into like family lore and mysteries or things that happened before we were born. So I sometimes have students that will be like, you know, I don't know how to write about my father losing his job or my mother having that affair when I was little because I was too little and I didn't know the facts. And I always remind them about this thing that he's doing in these last lines here, of course, about himself, but you can also do it for other people. This power of sort of wondering and imaginative thinking and supposition. The power of imagination in creative nonfiction is very important. Another one of the books that started the whole memoir craze was The Woman Warrior by Maxine Home Kingston. And she grew up in a Chinese family that was very conservative, and her parents they were afraid for her to do anything. They were the type of parents that might have bound her feet as a child, had it been the old world. And she imagined that she was like Fa Mulan. And a large portion of the book is actually not residing in the factual world of her everyday life, but in sort of the magical thinking or the wishful thinking or the desire line of the character. And I would argue that we can do that for ourselves, but we can also cue the reader in that we have left the world of facts, but we're still in the realm of emotional truth. It still is creative nonfiction if we say, I can only guess. I can't know for sure, but I think. I wonder if. Those are all wonderful things to do. The other thing that I wanted to write and talk about in combination with Tobias Wolff is the idea that he often writes about himself as a bad kid doing bad things. I mean, like, problematic for sure, confused, definitely. And for years I would read him and I would be like, wow, I don't know how he does that. I couldn't figure it out. Because I think psychologically, a lot of times when we first start writing, we really want to be a likable narrator. Our desire to be good will mess everything up if it takes over. But I knew that, like theoretically I knew that, but how do I kind of convince myself or trick myself to really let go of that judgment? It was essentially judgment that I had for myself when I was 17 or 18 or 23 or however old. And I always tell my students, avoid a cautionary tale. You don't want to tell people, don't do as I do, kids. We're not writing like a Aesop's fable. What we're doing is much more complicated, and people understand. People don't come to literature and read it through a moral lens. People are not there for that. We read books and we're okay with fictional characters doing all kinds of things. But for me personally, one of the strategies that I employed was this. I would think, I was making a mistake, but in my head, for example, at 17, I was trying to deal with that mistake. I had a strategy. I had a plan. I had an idea about how I was going to go about fixing it. And sometimes, most of the times, a lot of times we'll say, well, that idea was totally wrong-headed. But the only unlikable character is kind of an apathetic character that doesn't do anything because it doesn't work on the page. If you show yourself as energized, seeking, thinking your way through something, if you remember your intellect at every step of the way, and you try to explain your rationale for how you were dealing with the circumstance or situation, and you keep digging in that direction, you're going to develop a lot more compassion for yourself as a character. And we always say when we write about other people or in fiction, when we write about characters, you have to love your characters. In creative nonfiction, it's very important to learn to love yourself. And last but not least on this slide, I just want to comment that sometimes it's really hard for beginning writers to know the difference between like writing close to the body with the sensory details, like we have that GoPro on our head that I keep saying, and like the difference between that and writing that is actually introspection or interiority or kind of like, I don't want to say judgment, but like observation. And Mary Carr's piece, the first one, it didn't have a lick of character thinking. There was no interiority in that passage. But you'll note that in Tobias's, there is at the very end. If I didn't look too hard, I could almost believe I was moving. That's interiority. And learning the difference between the two, I found it kind of difficult. And if you want to practice kind of identifying in your body, like what is writing close to, what is writing with sensory details, and how is it different than introspection? Kathleen Finneran actually had me do this years and years ago. She was one of my very first teachers at Webster. Love her. And she told me to take a small notebook. She told everybody in class, she actually handed out those little small flip notebooks and said, take this into the world and make detailed physical observations about what you see and bring it back to class, and we'll read them in class. And so I would write things like, the rain gliding down the front window of my car glistens too bright for me to see through the windshield. You know, it's like blinding. Or there's a little boy in a Batman suit standing on a fire hydrant on the corner of my street. And these were straight up observations, but only if I stopped. If I went too far and I said, I might be afraid, I'm afraid I might get into a car accident because I'm being blinded. Or if I said, I wonder where the boy's mother is because it's a busy intersection, she would call me out on it. She would call everybody out on it. And it seems like such a simple thing, but learning the difference between you're doing telling or narrative summary to get into a scene, which is viscerally, sensory detail, viscerally felt, and then out again into narrative summary, you must be able to tell the difference and know when you're switching between the two. And it's a great way. I think you guys should try it. So let's go to the next slide. This is Layli Long Soldier. And I don't know how many of you know her. She wrote Whereas, won a lot of awards. She's a Lakota poet. And this quote actually comes from an essay that she just published just very recently in the offing. And the title of the essay is Now You Will Listen, Trust Issues with American Schools and the Care of Our Native Children. And actually we went to go, I ate noodles with her recently in Santa Fe. And she told me, and it's in the essay too, but she talks about how hard it is to be a Native mother and how her daughter was learning really sad and damaging, sort of like a lens on history in her history class that was hurting her. And that it was wrongheaded, and you know, and Layli and some of the other Native moms in town who are educated, and they said, well, maybe we should go in and talk to the principal and try to talk to the classes and introduce kind of a different perspective and history on all of this. And so this quote, which is also written very close to the body, though it starts with telling, as you'll see, rather than showing, and then it goes into a bit of research to create context, right? She says, anyone who lives on this land is a treaty inheritor, thus accountable to the methods by which this land was seized. These methods are why an American can live happily, for example, seated in a recliner inside a 2,500 square foot home with a golden Labrador and a mammoth trampoline purchased from Costco, saluting the sun in their grassy backyard. Americans of all backgrounds must acknowledge General Richard Pratt, the mind behind US boarding schools, as an ancestor in maintaining control over the original people of this land that Americans now occupy. Pratt, a bricklayer, a gravedigger for this grand, spacious American lifestyle. And I'm assuming that many of you are addressing ancestors and histories in your writing that have difficult stories of oppression, or that many of you feel burdened by histories that you were not alive when it happened, but it hurts you to hear about it now, right? And it's very difficult to go towards what feels painful, but a lot of times people will just write about the emotion of some stressful interaction and negotiation in modern society, and they don't look back to give it context. They let the history remain buried. They don't engage in the research that could possibly unburden them, right? You know, I remember when I first started writing and I thought, oh my gosh, I have never had anyone from my tribe. The Laguna Pueblo had Leslie Marmon Silko, but from the Quechan tribe, my other tribe, we have never had an author write a book that talks about our history. And I thought, wow, it felt so important. I thought, oh my gosh, it's almost like I'm going to save, you know, my people. It's going to save people. You choose your topic so earnestly. You care so much. It's almost like you're going to squeeze it to death. You know, it's like cute aggression. You're just going to, how do you get your objectivity when you're working in this? You're kind of exercising opposites. You care a great deal, Yet you also have to preserve the ability to gain critical distance. And I would argue that learning to sort of hang some history on the narrative arc of your story, to kind of flash back into things that give readers an education, because we read to gain information, is one excellent, excellent way to unburden yourself from that weight. And I also talked a little bit in the little bullet point on a few PowerPoints prior, I said that I would also talk about the idea of literary community as relief. And I talked about how it felt like the world was on my shoulders because I thought I'm the only one that can do this. And coming to Santa Fe now and being the director at IAIA and seeing a lot of young Native writers and middle-aged, all-age Native writers and non-Native BIPOC or anti-racist allies who attend my program write, it makes me feel like, well, if you get published and you get published and you get published, and I play a small part in that, it's not all burdening me, you know? And I don't have to be, my book could maybe not do very well, or it could do okay. But if I discover the next, like the native Toni Morrison, then I will have played a small part in this change that I hope will happen, that people become more educated and aware of BIPOC histories in this country. And, you know, the work can never be done in a single lifetime. We all know that, you know, and my grandkids will be inheriting this world. And I'm hoping that the values of Native American environmental values and ideas about climate and all of that will saturate and help and change minds. And when I think that I have to do all that by myself, it's very heavy. When I think that I can support a community that's doing it, it's much better. And so I tell people, I urge you all to be good literary citizens. You know, if you read a book, post something about it on Goodreads, review books, support people, go to readings, because by affirming your love of, by supporting other people, you affirm your love of the art form of literature itself. Let's go to the next slide. This one is Jamaica Kincaid. I just love this one. And this is I think this is my last one. This is from her book, My Brother, and her brother dies. And she's remembering him when he was little. The baby was wrapped in a blanket and placed close to her, and they both fell asleep. That very next day, while they were asleep, he snuggled in the warmth of his mother's body. An army of red ants came in through the window and attacked him. My mother heard her child crying, and when she awoke, she found him covered with red ants. If he had been alone, it is believed they would have killed him. This was an incident no one ever told my brother, an incident that everyone else in my family has forgotten, except me. One day, during his illness, when my mother and I were standing over him, looking at him, he was asleep, and so didn't not know we were doing so. I reminded my mother of the ants almost devouring him, and she looked at me, her eyes narrowing in suspicion, and said, "What a memory you have. Perhaps the things she most dislikes about me." And on that note, I just wanted to say that some of you have families that support you, and others have families that fear what you are doing. And I relate to all creative nonfiction writers, all memoirists do. Some families have taboos. And I wrote a piece that Roxane Gay chose for Salon about my uncle's funeral that revealed the funeral practices of my tribe that are held very near and dear to the people. And I went through this ethical sort of debate after I wrote it. It just came pouring out. It was one of I think it was only my second funeral I did, my first family funeral. And I didn't know whether or not it was okay to tell that story. And I remember, again, it was Kathleen Finner, and I was talking to Kathleen Finner, and she told me, maybe it's worse to be forgotten than to be remembered. I was very impacted by that because I realized that so much of my people's history has been erased. And I did not want to be complicit in that erasure anymore. I want there to be a record of who they were, and and to acknowledge that when bad things have happened, it's not a moral failure on their part, but it's an indictment of policies in the United States a long time ago that led us to this. And I would urge you to think very much about being bold and knowing which taboos you can confront and being okay with those things that you can't write about. I definitely feel that it's fatiguing to share so much of self. To be vulnerable is hard. And there are some things that you might feel are just too important for you to share. But I would also urge you to understand that no matter what somebody reads that you have written, they really can't know you. They're getting an approximation of you on the page. They can have a feeling about you, but we all have this kind of space inside that is sacred and private. We come into the world, we take our first breath. We're the only one that can do that. And when we die, we exhale, and the last breath, nobody can do that for us either. We're all kind of an island unto ourselves. So I don't know. I'll say one more thing about that. Maggie Nelson, who wrote Bluettes, I had a wonderful opportunity to study with her for just a weekend or like a week. She was a visiting writer in Iowa City. And she told us that it was never the thing in her, people would say, aren't you embarrassed about exposing, or don't you feel vulnerable about exposing this? And she would be like, not at all. I'm actually afraid of exposing like the glass of wine I'm drinking on page 5. And if you've read her work, there's no alcohol in it at all. But for her, that's the thing that feels very frightening. And so what your reader takes from you and what you think they're taking in terms of exposure might not even be the same things. I always say this, I paraphrase an author I like from South America, Alejandro Carpentier. He says, only a fool shoots an arrow and then runs after it and tries to control where it lands. The artist's job is to hand the work over and allow it to be interpreted by whoever receives it. So to make something jump off the page, we lean into memories, heighten moments of sensory perception, our most profound experience in the world, good and bad. I wanted to talk about self-care tonight because writing memoir is so hard. It's often reviled as navel-gazing, and in the worst case scenarios, it can be. There are ethical conundrums, ego deaths that you have to endure, and a million different struggles to get to the end of the book. And I wish that more of my professors in Iowa City had talked about self-care. For some people, their books are going to be written really fast, and some of those people might be your friends. Maybe their topics are not so close to the bone. Maybe they're just imagining a day on the beach, or they're just imagining the death of a sister. For the nonfiction writer, gaining distance on the material is definitely a struggle. I had writer friends through the years who asked me, why is it taking you so long? From the time I graduated to the time it was sold, it was like 9 years, 9 or 10 years. And I was tempted to feel ashamed, but I didn't allow myself to go there. I would not. I said, you know what? I'm going to take my time. I'm going to try to make something that feels finished and feels good to me. And I'm not going to worry about eyes on me at all. So my advice to you is to find solace where you can. And I've never told anybody this story except for my family, but I'm gonna tell you a story about one of the memories I have that gave me solace through the 10 years, and I still rely on it now. So I told you 10 years ago, I graduated from Webster. 20 years ago, I was living in Albuquerque, and that's when I first decided to start writing. And just like you guys are in a conference, I went to conferences, I listened to teachers and speakers. And this one writer kept stressing like passion. He was like, you have to make sacrifices to get the job done. And he defined writing kind of as manual labor, which is true. It's long hours sitting at the table alone. And he was like, you're conjuring. He was almost like conjuring a person who's like hearing voices and by themselves. So at the time I was like a very, I was a young mom with 4 little kids all in school. And some of them were still in preschool. And I didn't know where I was going to find the time to write. And my dad had always said, my dad always gets up before dawn and says, like, there's special blessings for people who greet the sunrise. And so this combination of this writer talking about my passion and my dad's advice, I thought, you know what? I'm going to start setting my alarm for like 3:50 in the morning, and I'm going to be at the table in the kitchen writing by 4 a.m. I'm going to write till 7. And so I'm not kidding. The very first morning that I rolled out of bed and made it to the kitchen table, something magic happened. So there was this pair of canned lights above the fireplace in the living room. And I was sitting with my back of the table to it. The kitchen kind of flowed into the living room. And they turned on all by themselves. And at first I thought, for the like a split second, I thought it was my husband who had gotten up and was bugging me. And I was kind of got mad. I turned around and I was going to tell him, I told you, you're not supposed to bother me. I'm making the sacrifice to get up super early. But when I arrived there at the edge of like the living room and looked, I knew instantly that everyone in the house was sound asleep. No one was awake. And when the fledgling writer starts out, they have hope in one hand and discouragement in the other. And that hope has to be nurtured because the discouragements are many. I hung on to this memory of the lights turning on for years. I actually told myself that it was proof that my ancestors were with me and wanted me to tell their history in my story. To dream of becoming an author requires risk. It feels risky for me right now to tell you the story about the lights. Do you see how I'm putting my subjective perspective on the line? I'm telling you something that is very particular and unusual and unique to me, knowing it will immediately affect the way you think of me. I take a risk telling you this story because I suspect that some of you might dismiss it as slightly crazy or magical thinking. And there's a small blow when I tell you that the novel that I wrote all those years ago at 4 a.m. in the morning was not good and it failed. And I ended up throwing it in the trash can. Thank you. I hope I didn't go too long.
Thank you, Deborah. That's a great story. It seems so hard to throw away that first book, but obviously something happened while you were doing that writing that paid off later. So we have time for questions. Are there questions that people want to add to the Q&A? We have a lot of thank yous, Deborah, in the chat. A lot of appreciation for the story, but also for your talk.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I hope everybody is having a wonderful time in their classes.
Yeah, well.
Oh, can you explain the use of paragraph of the?
Yeah, I wasn't sure what that meant.
Yeah, Carolyn, I see that's you. Yeah, she is a poet, and you have to ask Laylee. I think she wants you to pause. I think there's thoughts within the thoughts. I've never seen it be done. She's Laylee Long Soldier. She has a lot of readers, and I think that I would love to hear her answer that question as well. Oh, and I see that the superiority was for the Mary Carr quote. Yeah, she does. She has a lot of superiority, that's for sure.
Yeah. So Deborah, we also have a question. Do you let your family read your work before you publish?
That's so interesting. Not before. I usually go out with it, and I was amazed by how supportive they are, especially because 20 years ago when I was in Albuquerque, my mother was very resistant to the idea of me writing, which was crazy because she was the one in the family that read all the time. Like, she was a reader. She took us to the library. She was constantly reading books. She was frightened. I think a lot of you probably have family members who are frightened. I've heard people say before, you're really pushing to live a dream when you start writing. And it's so self-contained and focused that people that are kind of not sure what they're doing yet maybe feel, like maybe they're not fulfilled. I don't know what it is, but they are frightened by it. They're frightened by your passion. They're frightened maybe by you writing about them. But my father arguably has the more sort of cinematic and dramatic stories that I tell. And I think he has always said that he feels very, very comfortable with me telling them. But I know that now that the book is sold and, you know, it was a full manuscript when it went out and we're just tweaking it. I probably am getting to the point where I need to allow him to read it. And I would add one thing to that, though, to this whole conversation. I'll just tell you a snippet of another story that maybe in 2018, I published a piece in a public space. And it's a version, an old version of the first chapter of the book. And it's had some stuff cut from it now, but I told the story about how we had this puppy when it was a dog, not a puppy, when I was a little girl, and it was a beagle, and she had puppies. And we put the puppies into the back of our van to drive down to visit our family on the reservation. It was a long drive. And the box was covered, and we got in the van early, and me and my sisters were sleeping. And when we woke up, my mom had cut little holes in the box, but it wasn't enough. They were all sweating when we opened up the box, and we felt so sorry for them. And we gave one away, I remember, at a Tasty Freeze on the road heading down where we stopped to eat, and we gave them away gradually through the trip to family members and friends. And I always remember that that box had 12, like it was a lot of puppies in there, 12. And I actually had written about it. And my sisters, my older sisters, when they realized that I thought there were 12 puppies, they laughed at me and told me that I was completely wrong, that she had like 4 puppies. And I still can't believe them. And that's the weird thing, is you can give your stories to family members, and what your sister remembers and what your brother remembers and what your aunt remembers, all going to be different. And in the end, you really have to give yourself permission to say, I know what the emotional truth of my life is, and to go for it. You can't come to a consensus about what happened in a family. And so I would say, you know, aside from the larger permission that they give you to write, I wouldn't haggle with them too much over the particulars. It really can rob you.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have time for another question here. Deborah, in your talk, you walked us through several, quotes from several memoirists. What is your favorite memoir and why?
Ooh, that's a hard one. Favorite is hard. I think I have books on my shelf that are like Rick Bragg and Leslie Merman Silko, and oh gosh, I have so many. I love Maya Angelou. I love Mary Carr. I love Tobias Wolff. I love Jamaica Kincaid. The thing is that when it feels like when you first start reading, you read really, really widely everything that you can. Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight. Oh, that's a good book. And then it feels like you find your bookshelf dwindles in terms of what you refer to do your own writing. And it's kind of like Henry David Thoreau, I think he said, if you want to learn about a trail, don't go on 10 different hikes in a new region you visit, go on the same hike 10 days in a row. And so if you read the books that you really, really like over and over and over and over and over again, and study their frame and their structure, you're going to start to learn when the author goes from scene to narrative summary to flashback to a little bit of interspersed history, how they use lists to pass time, what they're doing with language. And so if you had to like whittling it down, Tobias Wolff has been a huge influence for me. I think he really has been. I just love the way he implicates himself and doesn't pull any punches, and yet really reveals his moral education and his humanity.
So Deborah, I just wanted to thank you again for a talk. As you can see, so many people really appreciated and felt comforted by your talk, and really uplifting people. So I also want to take a moment to thank my colleague John Hinderleiter, who's our marketing director. He's been quietly running this series behind the scenes, as well as communicating with our audiences. John will be leaving University College in August, so this is my last chance to publicly thank him. So I wanted to do it here. I also want to thank our audience for coming this evening and for being with us really over the past 3 weeks. You can find links to many of our previous talks on our Summer Writers Institute website. You'll see Deborah Taffa's, a link to Deborah Taffa's talk come up there too. And you can also see upcoming programming for the winter in the coming months. So I look forward to seeing those of you who are participating in the Summer Writers Institute on Sunday. And again, thank you, Deborah, and have a good evening, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.